I'm Angeline Hartmann. I'm a veteran crime reporter now working at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, where I use my media expertise to help families and law enforcement seek answers. My craft is storytelling. My passion is crime fighting. Hi, everyone. In this special edition of Inside Crime, we go inside the U.S. Secret Service. My interview with Director James Murray took place at the agency's headquarters in Washington, D.C. It was a great conversation. Did you know that you wanted to be the Director of Secret Service when you were growing up? Maybe not the director, but, you know, sometimes it happens you talk to somebody and they say, oh, I always knew so-and-so was going to be the president of the United States. Or sometimes kids say, I want to be the president when I grow up.
Right.
Like, what did you say to yourself?
So I'll answer that in two ways. One, I knew that I did not want to be the director of the Secret Service for most of the 24 years I was in the Secret Service.
While you were in the Secret Service, okay.
I definitely knew that. So I tripped. I was fortunate enough to trip and fall into this hole, but it's an honor and a privilege. But I have known since I was real young that I wanted to get into law enforcement.
Public service.
My dad was a state trooper in New Jersey.
So it's in your blood.
Yep. And so I always had the idea of either going into the military, going into law enforcement. Had the opportunity in college I had an ROTC scholarship, so I got to spend a little bit of time in the military. I was nothing special at all, but that experience sort of was the impetus to continue working on myself. And then, you know, as I learned more about law enforcement opportunities writ large, Secret Service was always prominent.
How big is the United States Secret Service now?
We're just under 8,000 people.
It's relatively small agency compared to other government
Very small.
agencies.
It's small by design. And out of that, just under 8,000, about 3,400 are special agents. 1,600 are what we call uniform division police officers. For anybody who's been around the White House or seen the White House depicted on TV, you've seen those officers, but they do a whole lot more than that. They do a lot of our specialized law enforcement operations that are conducted by Uniform Division, or UD as we call them. And then the balance of that 8,000 are mission support. So that's butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, it's scientists, it's people doing, the lion's share of the work that goes on here in the Secret Service.
With so much criticism these days of law enforcement, I just, have to say thank you for your service. You're a career agent. I mean, but, there's so much criticism against law enforcement.
Yeah.
What would you say to all of that negativity,
Well, it's obviously predominant, right, in the last couple of years, and I understand why. I guess if somebody asked me that question and they asked me, hey, convince me why I shouldn't, assume this, I would just suggest that the presupposition should be that people go into law enforcement because they're called to go into law enforcement, the same way they're called to teach, the same way they're called into healthcare, the same way they might be called into, a life and faith service. But people are called. Now, I'm not so Pollyannish to tell you that there's not people who join law enforcement who shouldn't be there, and there might be some people who either should never have been there or somehow lose their way. But there are systems in place in all these agencies to check those things, and there's checks and balances. I guess a simpler way to respond is I think there's just I wish there was more of a willingness to listen and be more circumspect and sort of considerate of. You have, I don't know what the number is, somewhere in the area of 700,000 law enforcement officers in this country. The overwhelming majority are there because their heart and their soul are calling them to be there.
And when you talk about listening, I appreciate everything you just said, which is why we have this podcast. We want to do what we can to let people understand the humanity behind the badge. Yeah. It's so important right now.
Yeah. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you for touching on that. I appreciate that. And
sure.
Now, to really understand how the U.S. Secret Service works, I asked Director Murray to tell me a little bit about the agency's history.
Our story goes back to 1865, and actually April 14th of 1865. And on that afternoon, there's a legend that Lincoln's last official act was to authorize the creation of the Secret Service. And, what he was trying to do that day was to deal with a threat. But the threat had nothing to do with the protection of presidents or national leaders. He was trying to deal with a threat against the economy, and that threat involved counterfeit currency. So certainly an extremely sad irony to note that just a few hours later, he'd go to Ford's Theater, which is about a block and a half from where we're sitting right now, and he'd be assassinated.
That was 1865. Today, the mission of the U.S. Secret Service has greatly expanded.
So on the investigative side, we started out fighting, chasing counterfeiters. We're still involved with counterfeit. It still does pose a risk to our economy left unchecked. But I'd say about 40 years ago, the Secret Service sort of shifted its investigative focus to the financial crimes world and specifically the digital world, because as the U.S. and the world economy shifted to a more digital platform, that's where we saw there was going to be a lot of opportunity for fraud. And that's kind of where we do the lion's share of our investigative work nowadays, specifically with cyber-enabled financial crimes. At the same time, we have this very, very broad protective mission requirement. So we have right now somewhere in the area, and it changes from time to time, of about 40, 45 or so U.S. persons that we protect. So that's the president, it's President Biden, his family, Vice President Harris, her family, and then a whole host of others. I would imagine that a lot of your listeners wouldn't be able to identify number 44 or 45. But we protect people for two reasons. Either by statute, federal law requires us to do it, or a sitting president directs us to do it. And then another part of our protective mission has to do with foreign heads of state and heads of government. We're also required to protect them when they come here to our country. So that's about 250 countries. You could have presidents and prime ministers as well as their spouses when they travel over. So it's always been a unique responsibility of ours, but it requires a lot of investment and attention. And then for the last 25 years, we've also had this role as the lead operational agency for this thing called National Special Security Events, or NSSEs. And NSSEs can be a lot of different things. They were born out of the experience we had after the bombing in Atlanta in 1996, when it was pretty clear to President Clinton and our leaders on Capitol Hill that there really was no unified command, or there really was no tool in place to ensure collaboration between federal, state, and local law enforcement and public safety folks. And we serve as the lead agency for operational security, planning and design, and execution for these events. So what are these events?
I was just going to say, what are designated events, and who determines what you have to be asked to?
Yes, that's a great. We have to be asked. We've had them since the late 90s, and once upon a time you've had Super Bowls that were NSSEs. Now they're typically not, but you have things like the inauguration. That's an NSSE. The Republican and Democratic National Conventions and NSSE. If the Pope comes here to this country, that's going to be an NSSE. If the G20 is hosted here in this country, and so on. That's typically the types of events that we serve in that role for. So that's kind of
it's a lot.
That's rounding out in really broad strokes what we do on the protective side of the house, and then again we're carrying out that investigative mission at the same time.
Another important program that you may not have heard about is NTAC, NTAC. That stands for National Threat Assessment Center.
Obviously, we're responsible for investigating threats against anybody or any facility that we protect. And that's been true for, again, about 120 years now. For many decades, our threat assessment model, our way of conducting business in that arena was there's a threat. We go out and investigate it, and then we determine whether there's any veracity to it, or there's anything to it, and we handle it accordingly. For us, going back, it's 40 years ago this year, to the Hinckley assassination attempt, that was a watershed moment for the Secret Service, because what we learned, and the world has learned in the weeks, months, and years afterwards, was there was a lot more to the story with John Hinckley. Right, John Hinckley.
What led up to it, and what were the signs you're saying?
John Hinckley was quite literally inspired and motivated by a movie called Taxi Driver, starring Robert De Niro, where Robert De Niro played a character who was modeled after, if you will, an individual named Arthur Bremer, who attempted to assassinate George Wallace and almost killed him locally here, right here in Laurel, Maryland, back in 1972. That character was based on a real thing. So Hinckley's inspired by that movie, and he develops an unnatural obsession with a young actress in that movie named Jodie Foster. And in an attempt to impress Jodie Foster, he somehow deludes himself into thinking that, by going out and hurting somebody, hurting a person of national recognition, somehow that's going to attract him to her, is my understanding. What we didn't know in March of '81 was that, whether we realized it or not, John Hinckley had not just entered our lives in the Secret Service. Now, granted, I was 12 years old, so I wasn't here, but I talk about it in the first person plural. But what the Secret Service did not know is that he had not just entered their lives. He'd actually been circling Secret Service operations for a while, and he was on the campaign trail following Carter for a number of years because he had an ideation to make a similar attempt against Carter. So it was in the after action review, the hot wash of that event, the Secret Service realized that our threat assessment model can't be on demand. It can't be wait for a threat to happen and go learn what we can about that person. We need to figure out what causes this kind of concerning behavior. How do we determine, or how do we assess whether or not this concerning behavior exists? And so it kind of turned our threat assessment practices upside down. And in the years that followed, we really spread out, and we started to study, engage with, interview folks that had gone out and committed heinous acts, assassination attempts that didn't have anything to do with the Secret Service. So like Mark David Chapman, who killed John Lennon. We went out there and we studied. It became known as the exceptional case study. We looked at we snapped a timeline of about 50 years, and we looked at more than 50 subjects and incidents and tried to get a sense, not so much psychologically what we can learn, but what was it that was driving those folks to demonstrate these concerning behaviors, and then in reverse, how can we as law enforcement, not just in the Secret Service, but also our partners state and locally, determine that these concerning behaviors might be an indicator of something else.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's something we realized we had to do, and we really worked to refine throughout the 80s and into the 90s. And then Columbine happened. Mm-hmm. And when Columbine happened, we realized that, there was a lot of stuff that we were doing that was not proprietary to Secret Service protective operations. There were things that we do that are not classified, they're not top secret, they're things that we could do that we could share in a more broadly, not just with law enforcement, not just with educators and administrators in the education field, but both public and private sector, to kind of say, hey, here's the science and math of how we try to keep our protectees safe. We want to share it with you. And so the initial effort was a report on school shootings in the wake of Columbine, conducted by the National Threat Assessment Center. National Threat Assessment Center resides here in Secret Service headquarters, but we actually execute all of our threat management investigations and our operations via our field operations. We have more than 160 offices worldwide, and it's those agents in the field that go out there and conduct those investigations. NTAC is one element of PID, and NTAC in the past
NTAC.
National Threat Assessment Center.
One.
Yes, and National Threat Assessment Center is not, well, there's agents in there, but it's primarily social research scientists and folks that spend their time and they commit themselves to studying this sort of behavior and these sort of events. And we've had, I think, in excess of 20 different external studies that we've provided. We conduct for the benefit of the education field, or a yearly report that we put out is called MAPS, Mass Attacks in Public Spaces, where they look at mass attacks and they kind of share the lessons learned with the community. How do they do that? Well, they do publish these products, but the bigger way they do it is they engage with the public. They are educators. They go out there and they deliver training, and more importantly, they provide consultation to communities and organizations that want it. So I'm glad you said that a lot of people don't know it. We're really doing all we can to change that. We're a small agency. NTAC's a small outfit, but there's no nut too big to crack. I mean, we want to make sure people know that NTAC's here for, to basically be of service to your community.
So let's say I'm an educator out in Idaho, or I'm a school principal, and I want access to this information so that I can spread it, help my staff. What to look for, what to prepare for, how to.
The first thing you can do as an educator in Idaho is call our Boise office, the Secret Service office in Boise, and one of the agents there will help you get in touch with NTAC and put you on the right path.
Okay, so tell everybody to call their local Secret Service.
And candidly, if the reality becomes that, oh gosh, we have far too many requests that we can satisfy here in a short timeline,
everybody's listening to Inside Crime.
Right. That's
too
right.
many requests.
If that happens, that's a good problem to have. Right. We'll overcome that problem once we get there. But we were able, as a result of COVID, conduct a lot of international training. As a matter of fact, we just had a pretty neat little success story out of Brazil. There were some Brazilian law enforcement educators on a call, and based on some of the stuff they heard from NTAC and Dr. Lena Alathari, who's the director of NTAC, they basically said, hey, we may have an issue here. And what it is it provides the tools for a school to basically see whether it's an employee or a student, maybe even a member of staff, say, hey, some
red flags here.
Somebody's not doing well. It's not about labeling them as bad or putting them into the criminal justice system. That's not it. You have to have a very low threshold for intervention when it comes to engaging and identifying what's going on here. Some of it might just be being a teenager,
right.
10x, but some of it might be people who just need help. And that's a big part of what we do in the Secret Service. When it comes to threat management, or what we call PI cases, protective intelligence cases, threat cases, we arrest far, far, far fewer people than we take to get help at mental health facilities. So our
agents, a very important point that I don't think people understand.
Right. We're not interested. I mean, obviously, we're criminal investigators. We arrest people in if they commit a crime, but that's not what our goal is. Our goal is to help these people, get these people help. And so one of the things that's kind of unique about the Secret Service is that we've had this long-standing relationship with mental health professionals, the mental health community, and we're able to kind of build on that. And it provides an opportunity. One of the things you hear about in law enforcement over the last couple of years especially is things like de-escalation training. Well, that's always important, and you always want to look for new ways to do that. But in a way, that's a big part of what we do in Secret Service as agents and officers, is sort of identify and get a good sense of how to engage with folks who might be having a challenge in the moment, as to not escalate a situation that might not already be irrational because of what they're enduring.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Director Murray and I talk about the unique partnership between the U.S. Secret Service and NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, where I work as the Director of Communications.
I think our relationship goes back about 4 or 5 directors before me, and every single one of them has always expressed his or her, high level of dedication and commitment. Our relationship is codified in Congress, right? A big part of a significant part of our budget, we turn around and kind of reinvest in NCMEC. 2 primary ways the Secret Service aims to help with NCMEC. One is along the same lines as NTAC. It's with regard to engagement, and one of the earlier operations we got involved with was a program called Operation Safe Kids, where it's a very simple but really a brilliant idea, whoever had it, where Secret Service employees go out with partners from NCMEC to events like baseball games or National Night Out for law enforcement, and they'd set up a table and folks could come up with their children, and if they chose to, they could have a photo taken, or photos plural taken, of their child, and get their fingerprints taken. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the most rewarding things I got to do. I was able to serve in our Atlantic City office as a supervisor, and here in Washington Field office, and getting to do that. And obviously, as a parent myself, you understood one of the basic questions was, a dad would walk up and say, well, what are you going to do with my kid's photo? What are you doing with the fingerprints? And the answer is, we're going to give it to you. Because as you could tell me better, that even in the days of iPhones, right, we're 15 plus years into iPhones here, even with all the photos we have of our kids, how many of them are passport-like photos or photos that could be used for investigative purposes? Heaven forbid we ever need them as parents. Same with fingerprints. So that's something we've been doing for quite a while. And then in the last decade or so, we've also...
And just to interrupt you for a second, I think that helps assure parents, because for some reason they're very uneasy and they don't even approach the table because they see what's going on. They see people being fingerprinted and they say, I'm walking away,
exactly.
which is really missing an opportunity.
Yeah. What we do is we get some of the more charming amongst us to go out there as carnival barkers to try and bring people in, and you try to give them as much assurance, and you tell them even, my kids did it once upon a time when they were younger. And it's just critically important. And, you take it, you have copies, and God forbid you ever need it. Now at least you have it.
Yeah. And I think that's the other part of it. They don't want to think that they would ever need it. So they just don't go there. And that's honestly part of the problem with, trying to get awareness for the National Center.
Yeah.
Because it deals with such a heavy issue.
Yeah, it does.
Missing children and all the issues that are related to that.
Does.
People don't want to think about it.
Yeah.
But so it's our job to talk about it.
Yeah.
And make it comfortable.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a great program. I mean, it's funny. It's so simplistic, but it's got the same relevance that it did, almost 20 years ago when we started doing this thing. So we're proud to do that with NCMEC. And then along the same lines, in the last decade or so, we've been involved in sort of engagement in terms of briefings that we provide to the community in terms of trafficking and so on and so forth. So that's the one. Outreach is a big part of it, trying to assist in that regard. And then investigatively, we provide direct support to NCMEC and then agencies that support NCMEC. And we do that through a variety of ways. Obviously, we're pretty decent when it comes to cyber stuff, cyber analysis, forensic analysis, and exploitation. So we offer our services in that regard. We also, in our forensics division, have very highly skilled artists who will help with things like age progression. And then a big part of the support we aim to provide to NCMEC has to do with our polygraph program. And our polygraphers, I will tell you, are highly trained, just like all certified polygraphers are. But I don't think there's anybody better than our polygraphers, and they go out there and they work on not just new cases that come into NCMEC, but I'm aware that even recently there's a cold case out of the Carolinas where one of our polygraphers went and had the opportunity to talk to somebody who was suspected, and the individual admitted to murdering a child.
That was like a 40-year-old case or something like that.
Yeah, and it's funny that there's so many layers. As I said, as we were talking about earlier, the Secret Service is by design a small agency. The reality is we can't do this mission on the protective side of the house or the investigative side of the house without our federal, state, and local partners. So if we come to your hometown because the president's coming to town, the wheels don't roll if the local and state police are not helping us or our federal partners are not helping us. And so the way we try to give back is, part of our investigative mission, we have these things called cyber fraud task forces, which are actually both not just law enforcement. It involves private sector. It involves academia. We have about 44 of these, domestically and a few overseas as well. And then the way that we try to give back to the communities that help us so much is through providing training at a place called the National Computer Forensics Institute down in Hoover, Alabama, or NCFI. And so what we do there is we provide digital and forensics training to state, local, and tribal law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges. We opened our doors back in 2008, and we've trained about 12,000 in about 12 years. Those skills they learn are not isolated to fraud. Those are skills they can take back and support their own departments. Mm-hmm. So whether it's a straight up robbery case or a violent crime or something to do with fraud, their officers and their detectives there have this training. So that's something we also leverage. And we've had a lot of our NCFI graduates make some really great progress on cases that are important to NCMEC.
I'm telling you, this has been like the United States Secret Service, things you didn't know, right?
Yeah.
Because people, they really don't know.
Yeah. Part of that's the Secret Service's fault. We're pretty Spartan by nature, and it's we are. the last thing we want, especially when it comes to our protective mission, is we don't want to be the headline, right? That's not why we're there. We want to be invisible. It's kind of a silent ballet. We don't want to be making any noise, and that sort of is in our DNA. And we learned that from the people that kind of raised us here in the agency, and hopefully the folks that came after us are starting getting the same seeing how that's important. But it cuts both ways. If you're too Spartan and you don't get out there on podcasts and talk about the good work that the Secret Service does, and more importantly wants to do, like NTAC or NCMEC, then really you have nobody but yourself to blame. So again, thank you for the opportunity for telling that story.
Well, thank you for speaking with us. I know your time is precious, and we appreciate you giving Inside Crime the time.
Absolutely.
And that's it for this edition of Inside Crime. I'm your host, Angeline Hartmann. Be sure to check out InsideCrime.org for more information about this episode. Thanks, everyone.